A colossal statue lies shattered, its fragments scattered across the desert. That broken stone was once the image of a queen, and its destruction was no accident. This is the hidden pattern we are uncovering today, the systematic destruction of monuments built by female rulers in antiquity. Across centuries and continents, the physical legacies of powerful women were systematically erased from the landscape. By the end of this exploration, you will possess a new lens to see history, one that deciphers empty pedestals and temple walls as evidence of a deliberate campaign. Why were these monuments targeted with such precision long after these rulers had passed? How does the ghost of a demolished palace still shape what we believe about the past? When you look at the ancient world now, what do you think is missing from the story that shattered statue in the desert was not a victim of random chance? Its fate was part of a pattern, a blueprint for forgetting. To see this pattern clearly, we need to understand the difference between the slow erosion of centuries and a deliberate act of erasure. The term we are using is systematic destruction. This is not a simple case of a monument falling into ruin because a storm knocked it over or because people needed its stones to build a new wall. Those things happen to all ancient structures. What we are looking for is something far more targeted. Systematic destruction implies a coordinated effort, a cultural or political decision to remove a specific memory from the landscape. It is a form of historical editing, carved not into parchment but into stone itself. For the monuments of female rulers, this process often began the moment their reign ended or when a new dynasty seized power. The methods were chillingly thorough. It could start with something as precise as chiseling away a queen's name from an inscription, leaving a blank space where her identity once stood. It could escalate to the toppling of her statues, breaking them at the ankles so they would never stand again. In more extreme cases, entire temples or palaces she built were dismantled, their stones carted away to be reused in monuments celebrating her successors. This was rarely the work of rogue vandals. More often, it was state-sanctioned, ordered by the very authorities who took her place. The intent behind these actions is the crucial piece of the puzzle. This was not merely about recycling building materials. It was about severing a symbolic link. A statue is not just a piece of rock, it is a focal point for memory and legitimacy. By destroying it, the new rulers aimed to dissolve the public's connection to the old queen, to make her reign seem like a fleeting anomaly rather than a legitimate chapter in history. They sought to control the narrative written in stone, ensuring that future generations would see only the legacy they approved. Understanding this intentionality changes how we look at every scar on an ancient wall, every empty pedestal in a forgotten city. It transforms them from accidents of time into evidence, silent witnesses to a calculated campaign of disappearance. With this blueprint for erasure in mind, the real investigation can begin. The blueprint for erasure finds its most perfect and chilling execution along the sun-baked cliffs of ancient Thebes. Here, carved directly into the rock face, stands the mortuary temple of El, a breathtaking architectural marvel of terraces, colonnades, and serene symmetry. It was built by a ruler who commanded the wealth and respect of a Golden Age pharaoh Hatshepsut. For over 2 decades, she did not merely rule Egypt, she redefined kingship itself, adopting the full titles, regalia, and ceremonial role of a male pharaoh. Her temple was her ultimate statement, a stone and sandstone narrative proclaiming her divine right and glorious achievements. Yet, if you walk its halls today, you encounter a haunting paradox. Grandeur of the structure remains, but within that grandeur are ghosts. You see empty niches where colossal statues once stood. You run your fingers over smooth sections of wall where a carved image has been carefully, meticulously chiseled away. The stone itself bears the wounds of a calculated forgetting. Following Hatshepsut's passing, her stepson and successor, the third, launched one of history's most comprehensive campaigns of the condemnation of memory. This was not a frenzied act of rage. It was a slow, precise, and administrative process. Workmen were sent with chisels and hammers to systematically remove her name, her cartouche, from every inscription. Her elegant statues were toppled, deliberately broken at the ankles, and then buried in great pits near the temple, as if to hide the evidence of the crime. The scale is what stuns the modern observer. It would have required significant resources and sustained effort over many years. Why would a powerful pharaoh, the third, who himself led Egypt to military greatness, spend so much energy erasing a predecessor who had been dead for decades? The answer lies not in personal vendetta, but in profound political and theological anxiety. Hatshepsut's very existence as a female king was a crack in the foundation of Egyptian cosmic order. Kingship was intrinsically tied to masculinity, to the image of the ruler as the son of the god Amun. Woman in that role created a dissonance that threatened the legitimacy of the entire royal line. By erasing her monuments, was performing a kind of ritual cleansing on the landscape. He was surgically removing a perceived anomaly to reassert a seamless, strictly male lineage of pharaohs, conforming to an ideology that could not accommodate her precedent. The empty spaces on those temple walls are not just absences, they are loud declarations of a society struggling to reconcile power with tradition. This leads us to a deeper, more unsettling question. If the justification was rooted in preserving divine order, what does that tell us about the stories cultures tell themselves to justify such acts of erasure? The chisel marks on Hatshepsut's temple walls reveal a far more insidious strategy than statue toppling. To truly erase a pharaoh, you had to attack the very words that gave them life. In ancient Egypt, a ruler was not just a person. They were a collection of sacred titles, a walking formula of divine power. This was the royal, the 5 great names bestowed upon a king at their coronation. These were not mere labels, they were spells, legal declarations, and cosmic contracts etched in stone. They connected the ruler to the gods, proclaimed their right to rule, and guaranteed the stability of the universe itself. For Hatshepsut, these names were her anchor to legitimacy. And so they became the primary target for her successors. Workmen did not just deface her image, they performed a precise glyph-by-glyph excision. Where her cartouche, the oval ring containing her throne name, once stood proudly in an inscription, they chiseled a smooth, blank void. This act went beyond vandalism, it was a form of administrative and spiritual deletion. By hacking out these hieroglyphs, the third was attempting something profound. He was trying to delete her official reign from both the cosmic record and the bureaucratic one. He aimed to make it so that, in the eyes of the gods and the state archives, she had never formally been pharaoh at all. This practice has a name from later Roman history, the condemnation of memory. The goal was to make a person unmentionable and by extension memorable. It highlights a crucial ancient understanding that written word and carved image were not separate. They were intertwined forces projecting power. Destroying one was an assault on the entire system of legacy. This obsessive focus on text and title forces us to widen our gaze. If the written name held such power in Egypt, where else in the ancient world was it seen as a threat? The answer lies in the baked clay of Mesopotamia and the carved reliefs of the Roman world, where the names of powerful women would suffer a similar, carefully orchestrated fate. The obsession with names did not end with the chisels of ancient Egypt. It evolved, traveling across the Mediterranean to meet a new and formidable power adept at shaping reality through narrative. Centuries after Hatshepsut, another queen's legacy faced a different kind of systematic assault, one waged not just with tools but with words. The target was Cleopatra VII, the last active ruler of Ptolemaic Egypt, and the architect of her erasure was Rome. Following her defeat and the fall of Alexandria, the victorious Octavian, soon to be Emperor Augustus, confronted a unique problem. He had conquered a kingdom, but he needed to conquer a story. Cleopatra was not just a political adversary, she was a symbol, a living emblem of a rich, ancient culture that had dared to challenge Rome's supremacy. To secure his new province and his own power, Octavian understood that her symbolic presence had to be dismantled as thoroughly as her armies. This campaign operated on 2 parallel fronts, the physical and the perceptual, each reinforcing the other. In Alexandria, the city she had ruled, the process was likely swift and material. While evidence is scarcer than in the Egyptian desert, historians note that her statues were almost certainly pulled down. Many were probably melted for their bronze, a practical recycling that also served a political end. Others may have been recarved into the likeness of the new Roman emperor, or simply broken and discarded. Her image was systematically scrubbed from the visual landscape of the new Roman province of Egypt, a silent decree that her face no longer belonged to the public memory of the place. But Octavian's true innovation was coupling this physical erasure with a masterful propaganda offensive. He recognized that destroying a monument is one thing, destroying a reputation is another, and to do both is to achieve total historical control. To this end, He enlisted the most powerful voices of the age, the poets and historians. Writers like Virgil and Horace, working within the sphere of Augustan patronage, crafted a devastating and enduring narrative. In their works, Cleopatra was transformed. The shrewd diplomat and polyglot ruler vanished. In her place emerged a caricature, a decadent Eastern seductress, a threat to Roman virtue and order. She was portrayed as irrational, hysterical, and driven by dangerous passions. This was not casual slander. It was state-sponsored myth-making, a story designed to justify the conquest and the subsequent erasure. By painting her as a monstrous aberration, the Romans could frame their destruction of her monuments not as cultural vandalism, but as a righteous cleansing. The smashing of her statues became the logical conclusion to the smearing of her character. This dual strategy is what makes Cleopatra's case so instructive for our pattern. It shows how physical destruction and narrative distortion can work in concert. The Romans did not just want to remove her stone likenesses, they wanted to replace her entire historical persona with a convenient fiction. They succeeded so well that for centuries, the dominant image of Cleopatra in the Western imagination was the Roman fabrication, the seductress on the barge, obscuring the capable leader and strategist she truly was. This forces us to ask, when a monument is destroyed, what story is erected in its place? The void left by a toppled statue is never truly empty. It is quickly filled by the narrative of those who did the toppling. And sometimes that new story can be more permanent and more damaging than stone itself. But a toppled statue can also be a monument to defiance. 2 centuries after Cleopatra, in the shimmering desert oasis of Palmyra, another queen's challenge to Rome would meet a different, more immediate form of retaliation. Zenobia, the warrior queen, did not just rule her wealthy trading city. She dared to forge an empire of her own, seizing Roman provinces and declaring independence. Her ambition was carved into the very stones of Palmyra, in grand colonnades, temples, and statues that projected her power and divine favor. Then came the legions of Emperor Aurelian. The city that had dared to defy the empire was sacked, its wealth plundered, its walls breached. This was the standard, brutal consequence of rebellion in the ancient world. Yet within that broader devastation, a more specific erasure seems to have taken place. Historians examining the archaeological record note a telling pattern. While many structures in Palmyra were damaged in the fighting, certain monuments and inscriptions directly linked to Zenobia appear to have been singled out for particular attention. Portraits of the queen, especially those showing her in the regalia of independent rule, were often defaced. The stone faces were methodically hacked away, leaving a blank, anonymous figure where her likeness once commanded respect. Buildings she had commissioned or prominently associated with her reign were not merely damaged, they were symbolically reclaimed. A temple she might have dedicated could be rededicated to a Roman deity or the emperor himself. A triumphal arch celebrating her victories might be dismantled, its stones repurposed for a structure honoring Aurelian. This was not random chaos, it was a calculated demonstration. The Romans were masters of political theater, and the destruction of Zenobia's monuments served as a final, public act in the drama of her defeat. By targeting her physical legacy, Aurelian was performing a ritual of subjugation for the entire Eastern Mediterranean to witness. It sent an unmistakable message that the memory of her rebellion would be scrubbed from the landscape, and her city would be forcibly returned to the Roman fold. The erasure of Zenobia's face from stone was the empire's way of answering her defiance, a permanent warning etched into the ruins themselves. This blend of political punishment and cultural erasure in a single brutal campaign shows us the pattern adapting to a new context, but it also raises a haunting possibility. What if the intent behind such destruction was not just to punish the past, but to control the future? What if the empty spaces were meant to dictate what stories could even be told? The defaced statues and erased names point to a force far deeper than political rivalry. To grasp the true motivation for this systematic destruction, we must step into the mindset of the ancient world itself. The societies that built these monuments, from the banks of the Nile to the forums of Rome, were built upon a foundational belief that legitimate authority was a masculine domain. Political power, military command, and divine favor were threads woven into a single male-gendered tapestry. Kings were sons of gods, fathers of their people, warriors and priests. The very architecture of power was designed for a male figure to inhabit. When a woman like Hatshepsut or Zenobia ascended to the pinnacle of that structure, she did not just take a throne, she created a profound dissonance. She became a living contradiction to the core cultural script. Rule, these women had to perform a delicate and constant act of translation. Hatshepsut depicted herself with the ceremonial beard and muscular torso of a male pharaoh. Cleopatra aligned herself with the goddess Isis, a divine mother figure whose power could be accommodated within the framework. They navigated the system by appearing as exceptions, extraordinary individuals who could temporarily embody a role never meant for them. But their monuments told a different, more dangerous story. A temple, a palace, a towering statue, these were not temporary performances. They were permanent, immutable facts carved into the landscape. They stood as lasting proof that a woman could not only hold supreme power, but could also commission the very symbols of eternity. They were stone and mortar challenges to the established order, silent declarations that the rules were not absolute. This is where the impulse for erasure finds its deepest root. After such a ruler passed, the traditional power structure faced a crisis of memory. Her reign was an anomaly that, if left commemorated in granite and marble, threatened to become a precedent. It risked normalizing what was supposed to be unthinkable. So, the systematic removal of her monuments was rarely about petty revenge against the individual. It was a cultural and religious corrective action. It was the patriarchal system reasserting itself, performing a ritual cleansing of the public space to restore the perceived natural hierarchy. By chiseling away a queen's face, a society was not just attacking a person, it was reaffirming a principle. It was declaring that the proper order of the world, with men in public authoritative roles, had been restored. The empty pedestal was not just a void, it was a lesson, a warning carved in negative space for all future generations. This drive to correct the historical record through demolition reveals a startling anxiety. The lasting stone of a female ruler's monument was seen as a threat to the entire social fabric. But if destroying the stone was the solution, what does that tell us about the stories those stones were telling? Perhaps they held a power their destroyers feared most of all, the power of a different example. The silent anxiety of a culture was matched by the loud, practical demands of politics. For every chisel swung in the name of tradition, another was wielded for a far more immediate reason: to secure a throne. The systematic destruction of a female ruler's monuments was not only a cultural reset, it was often a brilliant, brutal piece of political strategy. A new leader, stepping into power after a formidable queen, faced a unique dilemma. Her grand temples and towering statues were not inert stone, they were reservoirs of her authority, still radiating symbolic power long after her passing. They stood as permanent reminders of her reign, potential rallying points for anyone who might still be loyal to her memory or hostile to the new regime. Allowing them to remain intact was a risk no shrewd successor could afford. So the solution was direct and visually spectacular. The monuments had to be neutralized. This process was a form of political hygiene, a cleansing of the landscape to prevent the past from infecting the present. By toppling a queen's statues, a new king performed a powerful public ritual. He was demonstrating in the most concrete terms possible that her era was conclusively over and his had definitively begun. It transferred what scholars call symbolic capital, the intangible authority embedded in those stones, from her legacy to his own. Sometimes this transfer was literal. Stones from her dismantled palace might be hauled across the city to build a new gate celebrating his victories. A temple she commissioned might be rededicated to a god he favored. This appropriation sent a clear message: every resource of the state, even the very stones of the previous ruler, now served the new order. The goal was to control the narrative of history itself. A dead queen could be a dangerous figure. If her monuments remained, she could evolve in public memory from a former ruler into a martyr, a symbol of a lost golden age used to critique the current leadership. By erasing her physical presence, a successor aimed to sever that emotional connection. He sought to prevent her from becoming a potent ghost in the political machine. This act of erasure was, paradoxically, a way of writing. It was editing the official story of the state, chiseling out a chapter to make the narrative of his own dynasty appear seamless, inevitable, and exclusively male. The empty space where her statue once stood was not just a void, it was a carefully crafted silence in the story he wanted told. But what happens when the stones themselves refuse to stay silent? When fragments buried for centuries are unearthed, what story do they tell that the successors tried so hard to suppress the chisel and the hammer were not tools of chaos, but instruments of precision? To understand the systematic nature of this erasure, we must examine the cold, calculated techniques themselves. The ancient world developed a formal vocabulary for forgetting, a set of methods that transformed destruction from an act of violence into a ritual of power. At the heart of this was the Roman practice known as the condemnation of memory. This was not a mob's frenzy, it was a senate's decree. When an emperor or a prominent figure was deemed an enemy of the state after their passing, their public identity was surgically removed. Their name was chiseled out of stone inscriptions, leaving a ghostly blank in the historical record. Their portraits, whether in marble or bronze, were systematically sought out and destroyed. But often the destruction was symbolic and specific. The noses of statues were broken off or the eyes were gouged out. This was more than defacement, it was a symbolic killing. In many ancient beliefs, a statue housed a kind of spirit or presence of the individual it represented. By breaking the nose or the eyes, the perpetrators aimed to blind and suffocate that spirit, to render it powerless and truly dead to the community. This practice reveals a profound ancient understanding that an image was not just a representation, it was a vessel of power itself. Yet there existed an even more potent and strangely elegant method of erasure. It was called the reuse of building materials. Imagine a grand temple commissioned by a queen, its columns standing tall and proud. After her reign, that temple is deliberately dismantled, but the stones are not discarded. Instead, those very same columns are hauled across the city and incorporated into the foundation of a new basilica dedicated to the emperor who defeated her. This was not mere practical recycling, though it certainly saved effort and expense. This was a profound act of symbolic conquest, was a way of digesting the past. By physically embedding the stones of the old regime into the monuments of the new, the conqueror performed a powerful magic. He did not just destroy his predecessor's legacy, he consumed it. He subsumed her authority, quite literally building his own glory upon the plundered pieces of hers. The old power was not erased, it was enslaved and repurposed, forced to support a narrative it was originally built to defy. These methodologies, from the ritualized breaking of a stone nose to the strategic reuse of a marble slab, show us a society thinking deeply about the mechanics of memory. They understood that to control the future, you had to control the physical environment of the past. The destruction was never random, it was a calculated performance, a silent speech delivered with hammer blows. Each chisel mark, each repurposed stone, was a sentence in a new story being written over the old one. But if the destroyers were such careful editors of history, what happens when we, centuries later, start to read between their lines? What clues did they leave behind in their very attempts to obliterate the past? But a hammer blow leaves a signature. The systematic nature of this ancient erasure is not a theory we simply imagine. It is a physical fact waiting in the soil, a puzzle pieced together by the meticulous science of archaeology. Think of an archaeologist not as a treasure hunter, but as a forensic historian at a crime scene that is thousands of years old. Their evidence is not a fingerprint or a bloodstain, but the fracture line on a granite shoulder, the precise angle of a chisel mark on a wall. Every broken piece tells a story of intent. For example, when a statue is found shattered, the archaeologist asks a crucial question. Did it fall from a great height, its fragments scattered by the chaotic force of impact? Or are the breaks clean, concentrated at the ankles and knees, suggesting it was deliberately pushed over from its base in a controlled manner? The pattern of the breakage is the first clue. Then they examine the stone itself. The tool marks left by a metal chisel are distinct from the weathering of wind and sand over centuries. By studying these marks, an expert can often determine the type of tool used, the direction of the strike, and even the skill level of the worker. A haphazard, angry scratching looks very different from a methodical, patient gouging, intended to remove a name letter by letter. This careful analysis transforms a damaged wall from an eyesore into a document, one that records the procedure of forgetting. Perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from discoveries like the cache found near Hatshepsut's temple. There, not far from the grand terraces, archaeologists uncovered a deep pit. Inside were not random rubble, but but the carefully buried fragments of her colossal statues, broken at the ankles and laid to rest. This was not a trash heap, it was a secret grave for her stone likenesses. The act of burial is profoundly telling. It suggests a desire not just to destroy, but to hide the evidence of that destruction, to remove these powerful symbols from public view completely. This is the archaeological smoking gun, proof of a coordinated state-managed campaign. By mapping where such fragments are found and analyzing the layers of earth they lie in, archaeologists can reconstruct a timeline. They can determine if the statues were toppled during a single event, like a sack of the city, or if they were removed gradually over years in a sustained policy. Each layer of soil, each position of a stone fragment, adds another sentence to the story. Through this painstaking detective work, silent stones finally speak. They testify to the political struggles of a vanished age, revealing not just that a queen was erased, but how, and with what deliberate care. This forensic lens allows us to see the empty spaces not as absences, but as artifacts of a calculated process. And if we can reconstruct the method of their erasure, what might we be able to recover of the figures they tried so hard to silence? The forensic evidence of chisel marks and buried statues provides a stark clarity. But history is rarely so obligingly simple. As we move from the deserts of Egypt into the cosmopolitan whirlwind of the Hellenistic world, the pattern of erasure becomes more elusive, tangled in layers of time and competing narratives. Following the conquests of Alexander the Great, a new era dawned where Greek culture fused with local traditions across the eastern Mediterranean. In this dynamic landscape, queens like the Second of Egypt and Cleopatra of the Seleucid Empire wielded immense power, ruling not as mere consorts, but as co-regents and sovereigns in their own right. Their monuments were as hybrid as their world, blending graceful Greek columns with the solemn symbolism of Egyptian temples, physical testaments to a new, interconnected vision of authority. Yet finding the definitive scars of their systematic removal is a far more complex task. The widespread destruction of this era presents a murky picture. Yes, Roman conquest swept through these kingdoms, bringing with it the familiar political motives for dismantling a rival's legacy. But other forces were equally destructive. The Mediterranean basin is seismically active, and powerful earthquakes toppled countless structures, indifferent to whether they celebrated a king or a queen. Centuries later, as Christianity became the dominant faith, pagan temples were systematically repurposed into churches or for their stone, a religious transformation that erased entire categories of monuments without regard for the gender of their original patron. This overlap of causes creates a profound ambiguity. When we look at the ruins of a temple dedicated to, is a missing column the result of a Roman general's order, a tremor from the earth, or a medieval builder needing good limestone? The evidence is often silent on motive. This very ambiguity, however, is critically instructive. It teaches us that systematic destruction does not always announce itself with clear political chisel marks. It can be hidden, camouflaged by natural disaster, or layered under the legitimate needs of later generations. This forces the historian to adopt a more critical, nuanced approach. We cannot assume all damage is politically motivated erasure, but we also cannot dismiss the possibility simply because other explanations exist. We must sift through the stratigraphy of history, layer by layer, asking careful questions about timing, location, and selectivity. Did the earthquake only damage structures associated with female rulers? Was the temple of a queen the only one in the city stripped for its stone during the Christian era? The fragmentary record of these Hellenistic queens thus highlights a deeper, more pervasive challenge: the difficulty of recovering women's history from antiquity. Their stories are not just obscured by deliberate acts of, but by the chaotic accumulation of time itself, where even natural forces can become unwitting accomplices in their disappearance. This layered loss makes every surviving fragment, every ambiguous ruin, all the more precious. It prompts us to listen more carefully to the whispers that remain, to ask what forms of legacy, beyond stone and mortar, might have endured when monuments themselves were so vulnerable. Yet the pattern we have traced is not a universal law. History holds fascinating exceptions, and they test the very rules we have uncovered. The Eastern Roman Empire, known as Byzantium, presents one of the most striking counterpoints. Here, we encounter Empress Theodora, the wife of Emperor Justinian I. Her story is one of immense power and enduring controversy. Rising from a humble background in the theater to become the most powerful woman in the empire, Theodora was a key partner in Justinian's rule, influencing law, diplomacy, and even the brutal suppression of the riots. She was, by all accounts, a formidable political force, and she faced scathing criticism in her own time, most famously from the historian, whose secret writings painted her in a viciously negative light. Yet, when we look for the physical evidence of systematic erasure, we find something remarkable. It is absent. There was no state-sanctioned campaign to chisel her face from the walls or topple her statues after her passing. Her most famous portrait survives in radiant glory. Travel to the Basilica of San in Ravenna, Italy, and look upon the shimmering golden mosaic. There she stands, Empress Theodora, draped in imperial purple and laden with jewels, her gaze direct and imperious, holding a chalice as she participates in a sacred ceremony. This image was created during her lifetime and remains perfectly intact, a testament in glass and stone to her sanctioned public majesty. Why was Theodora's legacy spared the hammer and chisel that befell so many others? The answer lies in the unique political fabric of the Byzantine court. Justinian's authority was not just powerful, it was absolute and divinely ordained. The imperial office was a sacred institution. Theodora's power, however vast, was fundamentally derived from her position as the emperor's wife and co-ruler. Her monuments, like the mosaics in San, were not testaments to her personal rule. They were extensions of Justinian's own glory, components of a larger program celebrating the imperial couple as God's chosen regents on earth. To destroy her image would be to vandalize a piece of the emperor's own legacy, to mar the harmonious divine order the art was meant to project. In this context, her controversial persona could be tolerated, even immortalized, because it was safely contained within the unchallengeable framework of the emperor's supreme authority. Her story was part of his story. This Byzantine exception is crucial. It does not break our model, it refines it. It reveals that systematic destruction was not an automatic response to a powerful woman, but a tool deployed under specific conditions. When a female ruler's power was seen as an independent challenge to the established masculine structure of authority, her monuments became targets. But when that power was framed as an integral, supportive element within a supreme and stable dynastic system, her physical legacy could be sheltered by the very institution it adorned. Theodora's serene face in Ravenna forces us to ask a more nuanced question. It was never just about gender and power alone, but about the story a culture tells about where that power rightfully resides. The preservation of her image speaks volumes about the confidence and the absolute nature of the throne she stood beside. The serene face of Empress Theodora in Ravenna shows us that preservation was possible under the right political shield. But what happens when that shield is not just removed, but turned into a weapon? The rise of new, all-encompassing belief systems introduced a powerful new force into the ancient landscape, one that could erase not just a ruler but an entire pantheon. This was religious iconoclasm, the deliberate destruction of religious images. And in its sweeping fervor to cleanse the world of false idols, it provided a perfect and devastating cover for the continuation of gendered erasure. When a queen's monument stood not just as a symbol of her power, but as a temple to a goddess she embodied, it became doubly vulnerable. The arrival of a monotheistic faith, whether Christianity or Islam, with its strict injunction against graven images, created a theological mandate for demolition. A statue of a female ruler was no longer seen as a political statement to be debated. It was reclassified as an idol to be smashed, a sin to be purged from the earth. This shift in perception was catastrophic for historical memory. It allowed the specific, targeted removal of a woman's legacy to be folded into a much larger, religiously righteous campaign. The political motive, the anxiety over her independent authority, could now be buried deep beneath a layer of pious justification. No one needed to say they were destroying the monument because a woman had dared to rule. They could simply say they were destroying it because it was an offense to God. The gendered significance of the act was masked, lost in the noise of a broader cultural revolution. Consider the fate of countless temples dedicated to goddesses like Isis or Athena, who were often closely associated with ruling queens. As these sites were abandoned, converted into churches, or dismantled for their stone, the memory of the mortal women who built them and there was often erased as collateral damage. A column from a temple of Hera, funded by a Hellenistic queen, might end up in the foundation of a Byzantine church, its original patron forgotten not by political decree, but by theological necessity. This made the pattern of systematic destruction far harder for later historians to discern. The evidence becomes a tangled knot of faith and power. Was this temple destroyed because it celebrated a powerful woman, or simply because it was pagan? In most cases, the answer is both, intertwined so completely that they become inseparable. The iconoclasts likely saw only the idol, not the history. But the effect was the same. Another female figure vanished from the stone record, her story subsumed by a grand narrative of religious transformation. This use of iconoclasm as a cover reveals a chilling efficiency. It laundered the act of political erasure through the machinery of faith, giving it a moral authority that silenced dissent and accelerated the process. The stones of a queen were not just toppled, they were condemned as unholy, making their destruction a virtue. This forces us to look at the landscapes of the ancient world with a new, more skeptical eye. When we see a pagan temple reduced to rubble, we must ask what else, and who else was brought down with the gods. The shimmering mosaics of Theodora and the shattered statues of Hatshepsut are not the only battlefields in this war of memory. A quieter, more insidious conflict was waged on parchment and papyrus. The written word was both a primary target and a powerful weapon in the systematic campaign of erasure. We have already seen how names were chiseled from stone, a physical assault on identity. But the relationship between text and monument was a two-way street, a devastating feedback loop that amplified the silence. When a queen's palace was demolished, the act itself was often documented, but the documentation became a new layer of the problem. Roman historians, for instance, might record the destruction of a grand structure in a conquered city. Yet in their accounts, a crucial detail is often missing. They rarely note that the magnificent palace they just razed was commissioned by a ruling queen. Or if they do mention her, she is framed not as a patron of architecture, but solely as a political adversary or a moral scandal. The demolition is then justified as a righteous act against a tyrant, a necessary cleansing rather than a cultural loss. This textual framing is a form of secondary destruction. First, the physical evidence is removed from the landscape. Then, the historical record is carefully curated to minimize or distort what that evidence represented. The palace is gone, and the story of who built it and why is twisted beyond recognition. This creates a profound dilemma for anyone trying to piece together the past centuries later. How do you mourn the loss of something you never knew existed? How do you question a narrative when all the physical counterarguments have been reduced to rubble and dust? The written accounts that survive become the dominant, and often the only, lens through which we view these women. If every Roman text calls Cleopatra a decadent seductress and makes no mention of her scholarly pursuits or civic building projects, that caricature hardens into accepted fact. The partnership between material and textual erasure is what ensured a near-total blackout on the true scope of these women's legacies. It was a one-two punch of profound effectiveness. The hammer removed the monument, and the pen wrote the epitaph that blamed the monument for its own destruction. This forces us to read ancient histories with a critical, almost forensic eye. We must learn to listen for the silences, to question the glaring omissions, and to wonder what magnificent building, what elegant statue, what entire chapter of human achievement is missing from the story simply because the person who commissioned it did not fit the traditional mold of power. When the only record of a life is the indictment written by its enemies, where can the truth possibly hide? The quietest form of erasure required no hammer at all. Sometimes, the most effective way to dismantle a queen's legacy was not to smash her monuments, but to claim them. This is the strategy of architectural appropriation, a subtle and enduring form of conquest that rewrote history without a single shattered column. Imagine a magnificent temple, its foundation laid and its walls raised by the decree and treasury of a ruling queen. It stands as a testament to her piety and her authority, a physical anchor for her memory in the heart of the city. Then a new regime takes power. To destroy such a useful, well-built structure would be wasteful, but to leave it standing as a shrine to her glory is politically unacceptable. The solution is elegant and insidious. The temple is not torn down. Instead, it is rededicated. The statues of the goddess the queen championed are carefully removed. New altars are installed, now consecrated to a male god favored by the new king, or directly to the king himself as a divine figure. The original dedicatory inscriptions are chiseled smooth, and new texts are carved, proclaiming the building as a gift from the new ruler to the people. In a single ceremonial act, the labor, the wealth, and the sacred space she created are subsumed. Her architectural achievement is hollowed out and reborn as a monument to the very power that succeeded her. This process goes beyond mere renaming. It is a complete ideological takeover of space. Consider an audience hall built by a queen for royal ceremonies. Under a new administration, its vibrant wall paintings depicting her triumphs might be plastered over. New frescoes are painted, this time showing her successor receiving tribute or performing sacred rites. The hall itself might be renamed in his honor. The physical shell remains, but its soul, the narrative it was built to tell, is surgically replaced. This method reveals a sophisticated understanding of power. It acknowledges that a building is more than its function. It is a vessel for story and symbolism. By appropriating it, the new ruler performs a powerful magic. He does not just erase his predecessor, he consumes her legacy and digests it into his own. He demonstrates that every resource of the state, even the stones she set in place, now serve his narrative. The useful structure remains, but its original associative power, its connection to her authority, is permanently severed. This was not obliteration, it was a calculated, enduring co-option. The building stands for centuries, but everyone who enters it learns the story of the king who gave it to them, not the queen who actually built it. Her contribution becomes a ghost in the walls, a silent footnote by the louder text of male legacy. This clever theft of space and meaning forces us to look at ancient cities with a questioning eye. When we walk through a grand archway or stand in a vast courtyard, how many layers of ownership, how many erased names are buried beneath our feet? This architectural theft reveals a deeper, more comprehensive strategy for controlling memory. The most ambitious rulers understood that to truly erase a rival's legacy, you had to redesign the very stage upon which their story was told. This is where systematic destruction merged with the grand vision of urban planning. A new king, arriving in a city shaped by a queen's patronage, faced a landscape saturated with her presence. Her statues lined the processional way. Her temple dominated the main square. Her name was woven into the city's ceremonial geography. To simply remove these objects one by one would leave behind awkward gaps, silent questions in the urban fabric. The more elegant and more totalizing solution was to change the question entirely by changing the space itself. Ambitious urban renewal became the ultimate tool for memory management. A ruler would launch a massive public works project, not just for practical improvement, but for ideological cleansing. He would order the demolition of an entire district or the radical redesign of the city's ceremonial core. In the sweeping chaos of construction, the targeted removal of a predecessor's monuments could occur not as a series of isolated acts of vandalism, but as a seemingly natural, logistical step in the grand project of modernization. The old forum, where her statues once stood, is completely razed. A new, larger forum is built on top, its colonnades and temples dedicated to the new ruler's gods and his own triumphs. The old processional route is rerouted. A grand new boulevard is cut through the city, deliberately bypassing the sites most associated with her reign. In this calculated reshaping, her spatial legacy is not just removed, it is physically. The city itself becomes a kind of parchment. The old text, the urban plan that celebrated her authority, is scraped clean. And a new text is inscribed in stone and street layout, a text that tells only the story of the new regime. This practice shows us that control of history was, fundamentally, control of space. By dictating how people moved through a city, what buildings they saw, and what civic centers they gathered in, a ruler could directly shape collective memory. He could ensure that the daily lived experience of the citizens reinforced his narrative, while the physical prompts for remembering his predecessor simply vanished from there. Imagine a citizen who grew up walking past a certain statue every market day. One year, the entire square is closed for renovation. When it reopens, the statue is gone, and in its place is a magnificent new fountain topped with an image of the current king. The old landmark and the person it honored fade from daily conversation, not because of a decree, but because the geography of memory has been surgically altered. This use of urban planning as a tool of erasure is perhaps the most complete form of systematic destruction. It doesn't just attack individual monuments, it dismantles the entire context that gave them meaning. It answers a profound question: how do you make people forget? You don't just erase the symbol, you rebuild the world around it so thoroughly that the symbol's absence is never even noticed. The past isn't shattered, it is paved over. And with every new stone laid, a different version of history is set, quite literally in concrete. This desperate search for permanence led some rulers to a powerful yet perilous strategy. They sought to become not just remembered, but in the Roman world, the imperial cult presented a unique opportunity. For certain empresses and female members of the imperial family, official deification after their passing offered a paradoxical form of sanctuary. If the Senate formally declared an empress a goddess, her image transformed. A statue was no longer merely a portrait, it became a sacred cult object, a vessel for divine presence. Temples dedicated to her were not just civic buildings, but houses of worship. This religious status could create a powerful shield. To vandalize or destroy such a monument was no longer a simple political act. It was an act of sacrilege against the state religion itself. In theory, this divine armor could protect a woman's legacy from the petty rivalries of successive emperors, anchoring her memory in the timeless realm of the gods. The empress might find her likeness preserved in temples across the empire, her name invoked in prayers, her legacy seemingly insulated from the erasure that befell so many others. This was the ultimate attempt to write one story in stone that was also considered holy. But divinity granted by the state is a protection that can be revoked by the state. The safety found in deification was profoundly fragile, resting entirely on the continued stability of the political system that conferred it. A dramatic shift in imperial leadership, a civil war, or the rise of a dynasty hostile to the memory of a previous family could shatter that divine shield in an instant. An empress as a goddess under one emperor could be denounced as a tyrant or an unworthy figure by the next. Her sacred status would be officially stripped away, a process known as. In that moment, her temples and statues underwent a terrifying metamorphosis. They were no longer sacred objects. They were reclassified as dangerous idols, as monuments to a false and disgraced divinity. This made them not just permissible targets, but mandatory ones for a new regime seeking to demonstrate its piety and purity. The very strategy meant to ensure her eternal remembrance could now accelerate and justify her complete obliteration. The protective layer of religion became the bullseye for a new form of righteous destruction. This double-edged sword of deification reveals the precarious nature of preservation in the ancient world. A queen or empress who tied her legacy to the divine authority of the state was betting on that institution's perpetual endurance. She was exchanging potential political vulnerability for a form of religious armor, hoping that faith would prove more durable than fame. Yet history shows that when political theology changes, the gods of yesterday can become the demons of today. A monument's survival thus hinged on a volatile alchemy of ongoing political consent and unchanging religious doctrine, a combination that was rarely, if ever, guaranteed. The search for an unassailable legacy led some into a trap, where their monuments became even more conspicuous targets when the ideological winds shifted. This raises a haunting question about the nature of memory itself. If the only way to secure your place in history is to become a god, what happens when people stop believing the divine shield of deification was a fragile defense against a far more relentless and pragmatic force? Bronze does not care whose face it bears. A towering statue of a queen, cast in gleaming metal, represented a staggering concentration of wealth. In an age before industrial mining, such materials were not merely symbolic, they were a strategic reserve. When a dynasty fell or a treasury ran low, that bronze likeness became, quite literally, a bank account waiting to be liquidated. The systematic destruction we have traced was frequently by a cold economic calculus. The ideological desire to erase a female ruler's memory found a powerful ally in the simple, urgent need for raw materials. A temple's marble facade could provide fine stone for a new fortress. The gilded panels from her palace could be stripped and melted to mint coins bearing the profile of her successor. This recycling transformed an act of political vengeance into a seemingly practical, even necessary public works project. It provided a justification that resonated with everyone from the treasury official to the stone mason. Why quarry a new mountain when a perfectly good, pre-cut mountain of stone already stands in the form of a disgraced queen's monument? Confluence was devastating. Political condemnation provided the moral permission, and economic incentive supplied the manpower and urgency. A statue toppled for ideological reasons could be quietly hauled away and melted under the cover of fiscal responsibility, its destruction leaving no protest beyond the silent loss of art. Consider the fate of countless bronze statues from antiquity. We know they existed in great numbers from descriptions in ancient texts, yet so few survive. Their material was too valuable to remain as art through the tumultuous turns of history. During a siege, a city might melt its own statues, even those of beloved rulers or gods, to cast weapons or repair walls. In times of peace, a new emperor might order the bronze images of his predecessor recycled into plaques celebrating his own benevolence. For statues of controversial female rulers, this process was a double erasure. First, their specific memory was targeted by political forces. Then, their physical form was consumed by the indifferent engine of economics, repurposed into objects that actively celebrated the new order. A queen's likeness might end up as a handful of coins that jingle in a soldier's pocket, or as a cannonball fired from a fortress built with the stones of her temple. This pragmatic destruction ensured that opposition was minimal. Who could argue against putting valuable resources to use for the common good, especially if the figure being memorialized was already officially condemned? The economic rationale laundered the ideological motive, making the erasure not just acceptable, but sensible. It turned the act of forgetting into a civic virtue, a recycling of the past to build the future. Yet this very practicality leaves behind a haunting void in our understanding. It means that for every monument we know was deliberately destroyed, countless others may have vanished simply because they were useful. Their absence is not a loud statement of damnation, but a quiet whisper of utility, a reminder that history is often lost not to rage, but to reuse. When the value of a material outweighs the value of a memory, what chance does a face in bronze truly have? But was bronze alone a tempting enough target? The economic and political forces we have traced raise a fundamental question about the uniqueness of this pattern. After all, monuments to male rulers were also toppled, melted down, and erased from history. Roman emperors like Nero and Domitian suffered their names chiseled from arches, their statues pulled down. So is there anything truly distinctive about what happened to the legacies of these ancient queens? A closer comparison reveals a critical and telling divergence in both scale and justification. For a male emperor to be condemned, he usually had to commit specific, egregious offenses. He might be declared a tyrant for his cruelty, or judged incompetent after a military disaster, or deemed morally bankrupt by the Senate. His erasure was presented as a corrective, a removal of a bad individual from the role of honorable leaders. The framework of legitimate male rulership itself remained intact, even strengthened by purging a rotten example. The condemnation was about the man's actions, not his manhood. For a female ruler, the calculus was profoundly different. Her very accession to power was often seen as the original transgression. Because the cultural script reserved supreme authority for men, her monuments could be viewed as inherently illegitimate from the moment they were built. A successor did not need to prove she was a tyrant or a failure, though such charges were often added for good measure. The core justification for erasing her memory could simply be that she had ruled at all. Her gender itself was treated as a disqualifying flaw, making her entire reign a mistake that needed to be rectified in the historical record. This distinction shifts the nature of the destruction from a political response to an individual to a cultural enforcement of a norm. The systematic removal of women's monuments was less about punishing a specific crime and more about reasserting a fundamental principle, that the public landscape of power should be exclusively masculine. This helps explain the remarkable consistency of the pattern across vastly different cultures, from Egypt to Rome. While a male emperor's downfall might be sporadic, tied to the volatile politics of his time, the threat to a female ruler's legacy was a constant, simply by virtue of who she was. Her monument stood under a permanent shadow of illegitimacy, waiting for a regime change that would see them not as commemorations of a leader, but as violations of a sacred order. This deeper, ideological motive made the erasure of women's legacies more comprehensive and more final. It wasn't just about replacing one ruler with another. It was about editing out an entire category of human experience from the stone narrative of history. The silence left behind was not just the absence of a person, but the enforced absence of a possibility. This void in the cityscape does more than just hide the past. It actively shapes the future of memory. The cumulative effect of centuries of systematic destruction is not merely a gap in the archaeological record. It is a form of induced historical amnesia. When generations of people are born, live, and die in urban environments where every towering statue, every grand arch, and every imposing temple facade exclusively depicts male rulers, their collective imagination is silently tutored. The built environment becomes a teacher, and its lesson is subtle, pervasive, and powerful. It reinforces, without ever speaking a word, the idea that women in positions of supreme, sovereign authority were fleeting anomalies, political mistakes, or perhaps even the stuff of legend. The city itself whispers that the proper, natural, and default state of affairs is male leadership. The psychological impact of this visual curriculum is profound. It creates a self-perpetuating feedback loop that has echoed for centuries. If no physical evidence of a queen's reign exists in the public square, in the places where community identity is formed, then stories of her power begin to feel less real, less substantial. They drift toward the category of rumor or folklore. This absence makes it inherently more difficult for later historians, and the public they inform, to believe these women were truly significant actors on the historical stage. Their marginalization in the written narratives is then reinforced by their invisibility in the stone ones. We see this play out in the long shadow cast over figures like Hatshepsut. For centuries after her rediscovery by modern Egyptology, scholars struggled to categorize her, often framing her reign as a regency that overstepped, precisely because the monumental proof of her full pharaonic legitimacy had been so thoroughly buried and erased. The world her successors built made her seem like an impossibility. This cycle of erasure and disbelief is how a pattern of destruction transcends politics and becomes a force of culture. It teaches a society what to remember and, more insidiously, what to forget. It narrows the scope of the possible, making it harder for each new generation to even conceive of leadership in a different form. When every model of greatness presented in enduring stone is male, the concept of greatness itself becomes gendered. The empty pedestals and walls are not neutral spaces. They are active participants in writing history, broadcasting a message of exclusion that long outlives the rulers who ordered the chiseling. This raises a pivotal question for us today as we walk through museums and archaeological sites. How do we begin to recover from an amnesia that was so deliberately and so effectively engineered? The silent lesson taught by empty pedestals is not the final word. A counteroffensive began in the dust of excavation sites and the quiet of university libraries, a campaign of recovery waged with brushes and books. Modern archaeology and feminist historiography did not just add new facts to history, they changed the very questions we asked of the past. The rediscovery of Hatshepsut's temple at El in the 19th century was a seismic event. For centuries, the grand terraces were known only as a ruin, a beautiful mystery. As archaeologists began to clear the sand and decipher the walls, they encountered a paradox. Here was a monument of staggering ambition, yet the images and names of its patron had been meticulously erased. The very act of vandalism became a clue. Why would someone go to such lengths to remove a minor figure? The question itself led to the answer. The systematic nature of the destruction pointed to the profound significance of the person being erased. Then came the discovery of the statue pits. The careful, almost reverent burial of her shattered likenesses was not an act of contempt, but of containment, a desperate attempt to neutralize a power that even her enemies could not deny. Piecing those fragments back together, both physically and intellectually, forced a complete reevaluation of Egyptian history. A figure once dismissed as a usurping queen was revealed as a masterful pharaoh who presided over a golden age of art and trade. This was not merely finding lost objects. It was restoring a deleted chapter to the story of humanity. This forensic approach extended beyond the spade. A new generation of historians began to look at ancient texts with a different kind of scrutiny, a practice known as feminist historiography. They learned to read between the lines, to listen for the silences, and to question the assumptions of the male chroniclers who had long been the sole narrators. By re-examining known inscriptions, legal codes, and administrative records, they began to identify previously overlooked references. A passing mention of a temple renovation, a land grant signed with a feminine title, a tribute list that named a queen as the recipient, these tiny fragments, once ignored, started to form a new mosaic. They proved that women were not merely passive figures in the background, but active patrons, builders, and economic forces. A name chiseled from a wall in antiquity could sometimes be reconstructed from a copy of a contract found on papyrus in another city. The ancient campaign of erasure was being slowly, methodically countered by a modern campaign of systematic research. Each of these discoveries, whether a colossal statue fragment or a single line on a clay tablet, is a quiet victory against historical oblivion. They represent a reclaiming of narrative, a defiant act of remembering in the face of a centuries-long project of forgetting. This work challenges us in a fundamental way. It asks us to hold our understanding of the past not as a fixed story, but as a living dialogue between what was built, what was destroyed, and what we are still learning to see. The process of recovery is ongoing, an endless puzzle where every new piece forces us to reconsider the picture we thought we knew. The patient work of brushes and books has found a powerful new ally in the glow of a screen. Modern technology is now offering a profound countermeasure to ancient chisels, not by rebuilding stone, but by resurrecting memory in the digital realm. This is the frontier of virtual archaeology, where lasers and algorithms are piecing together what hammers once took apart. Using techniques like three-dimensional scanning and photogrammetry, specialists can capture millions of data points from a ruined site or a collection of broken fragments. These points become a cloud, a digital echo of the original form, which software can then reassemble with astonishing precision. The result is not a guess or an artist's impression, but a scientifically grounded model of a monument as it existed before its systematic destruction. This process allows us to perform a kind of historical magic. We can digitally reattach the head of a statue to its shoulders, filling in the blank space left by deliberate vandalism. We can take the scattered pieces of a frieze, discovered in a buried pit, and project them back onto the temple wall from which they were torn. The most powerful applications of this technology are immersive. Through virtual reality, anyone can now put on a headset and step into a fully reconstructed space. You could walk the pristine colonnades of a queen's temple, looking up at a painted ceiling that has been lost for. You could stand in a virtual city square and watch as the bronze statue of a ruler, melted down for coinage 2,000 years ago, is restored before your eyes to its original gleaming majesty. This digital resurrection cannot replace the original stone, and it does not undo the historical act of erasure. Its power is of a different kind. It restores presence to the public imagination. It makes the scale, the beauty, and the ambition of these lost monuments tangible in a way that a textbook description or a diagram simply cannot. For generations taught by an empty landscape, this is a revolutionary form of seeing. It serves as both an unparalleled educational tool and a subtle form of symbolic reparations. It is a way of saying, the attempt to erase you from history failed. We can see you now. This technological reclamation asks us to reconsider the very nature of a monument. If its purpose was to project power and memory across time, does a faithful digital reconstruction, accessible to millions worldwide, not achieve that goal in a new and perhaps even more democratic way? A digital resurrection can bring a lost queen back to life, but it cannot answer the most difficult question we now face. What do we do with the actual physical stones? This brings us to a profound and modern ethical dilemma, one that sits at the heart of archaeology itself. When we uncover the shattered remains of a monument, do we attempt to rebuild it, or do we leave the damage intact as its own form of testimony? This is not a question of technical skill, but of historical philosophy. On one side of this debate, there are those who advocate for meticulous physical reconstruction. Their argument is powerful. By carefully piecing together the fragments of Hatshepsut statues, for instance, and setting them back upon their pedestals, we are performing a symbolic act of justice. We are correcting an ancient wrong, restoring dignity to a ruler whose legacy was stolen. It is a way of saying that the campaign of erasure, while historically significant, does not get the final word. A reconstructed monument allows the public to experience the awe and scale the original builders intended. It makes the past feel present and tangible in a way that a pile of fragments in a museum case simply cannot. This approach seeks healing, aiming to close a wound left open by giving back a face to a figure who was deliberately defaced. Yet the opposing view holds that such reconstruction is, in its own way, another form of erasure. By gluing the pieces back together, we risk whitewashing history. We cover up the evidence of the political violence itself. Those clean fracture lines, the smooth voids where a name was gouged out, they are not just damage, they are documents. They are the primary source material for the very pattern of systematic destruction we have been tracing. To reassemble the statue is to dismantle that evidence, to make the ancient crime invisible. Scholars who favor preservation in leaving the fragments as found argue that we must honor the full biography of the object, which includes its destruction. The scar, they say, is part of the story, and perhaps the most important part. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality of how history is made and unmade through acts of power. This debate forces us to ask what we truly want from our encounter with the past. Are we seeking a sanitized, idealized version of antiquity, a theme park of perfect temples and whole statues? Or do we seek a more raw, honest engagement, one that includes the conflicts, the injustices, and the visible proof of how narratives were violently shaped? There is no easy answer because both impulses are valid. We yearn for the beauty and completion that was lost, yet we have a duty to preserve the truth of what happened, even when that truth is ugly. Perhaps the solution lies not in choosing one path exclusively, but in a thoughtful balance. Some sites might benefit from a partial, clearly marked reconstruction that shows what was, while leaving other sections to show what was done. Modern materials can be used in a visibly different color or texture, so the repair is honest and does not pretend to be original. This approach allows the monument to tell a dual story, one of creation and of destruction, side by side. It acknowledges that the legacy of these rulers is not just in the stones they laid, but in the fury those stones later provoked. The ethical weight of this choice reminds us that preservation is never neutral. Every decision we make about an ancient site, whether to rebuild it or to protect its ruins, is an act of interpretation. We are continuing the story, writing a new chapter in the long, contested biography of memory. And that responsibility asks us to look beyond the monument itself, to the deeper cultural currents that led to its creation and its ruin in the first place. The debate over whether to rebuild or preserve a ruin is not confined to antiquity. The ancient systematic destruction of monuments finds eerie echoes in today's debates over controversial public statuary. While the contexts are vastly different, separated by centuries and driven by distinct social forces, the core questions are strikingly similar. Who has the right to control public memory? How does a society deal with monuments to figures whose legacies have become deeply contested or even reprehensible in the light of modern values? The toppling of statues commemorating colonizers or individuals connected to the history of slavery in the 21st century represents a modern form of politically and morally motivated removal. It is a powerful, public statement that the narrative set in bronze no longer reflects the community's conscience. Understanding the ancient patterns we have traced from Hatshepsut to Zenobia helps us view these contemporary acts not as unprecedented vandalism, but as part of a long-fraught human history of using monuments as for political and ideological identity. In both eras, a statue is rarely just a statue. It is a claim staked in public space, a declaration of whose story matters. The ancient successors used chisels to enforce a return to a traditional, patriarchal order. Modern movements use similar symbolic dismantling to challenge historical narratives they see as celebrating oppression, and to demand a more inclusive public landscape. The parallel lies in the fundamental recognition that the built environment is not neutral. It teaches, it honors, and it can also inflict a silent harm by glorifying a painful past. When a community decides a monument's presence causes ongoing hardship, its removal becomes a way of editing the living story of a city, much as an ancient king might have done. This does not mean the acts are morally equivalent, but seeing them as part of a continuum allows for a more nuanced conversation. It moves us beyond simple labels of destruction versus preservation and into the deeper territory of who gets to write the next chapter. The empty plinths in our modern city squares, like those in ancient ruins, are not endpoints. They are questions posed in iron and stone. They ask us what kind of history we choose to live with and what new memories we are brave enough to build in the spaces we have cleared. A name carved in stone is a claim on eternity. In the face of a campaign designed to make these women unmentionable, the simple act of speaking their names becomes a quiet rebellion. Hatshepsut, Cleopatra, Zenobia, Theodora. To say these names aloud, to discuss their reigns and their building projects, is to perform a radical act of historical recovery. This very conversation, this video you are watching, is part of that defiant process. Each time we recount their stories, we are reinscribing them into the collective narrative from which they were so painstakingly erased. We are answering the ancient chisel with a new kind of inscription, written not in granite but in shared memory and digital space. The work of recognition begins with seeking out the fragments they left behind, the evidence that escaped the Great Purge. It might be a single line in a secondary inscription that casually mentions a temple she renovated. It could be a coin struck with her profile that survived in a forgotten hoard. Perhaps it is a foundation deposit, a ceremonial cache buried beneath a cornerstone bearing her name and titles. These are not grand, untouched monuments. They are whispers, hints, and echoes. But to find them, to piece them together, and to share them widely is to defy the ancient destroyers on their own terms. It is to say, your attempt to silence this history has failed. We see the shadow you tried to eliminate, and we are giving it a name and a story once more. This recognition is the essential first step toward a deeper restoration. We may not always be able to rebuild their palaces from rubble, but we can absolutely restore their rightful place in the human story. It is a restoration of context, of significance, of complexity. It moves these rulers from the margins of history, where they were placed by their successors, back toward the center, where their actions and ambitions always belonged. When we learn to look for their faint signatures in the archaeological record, we train ourselves to see the gaps in every historical narrative. We begin to ask, whose voice is missing from this account? What magnificent structure in this city feels anonymous, and who might have commissioned it? This shift in perspective does more than recover lost individuals. It enriches our understanding of entire civilizations. It reveals the ancient world as a more dynamic, diverse, and contested place than the monolithic stone record often suggests. The legacy we reclaim is not just theirs, it is ours. It is a more complete, more honest, and more interesting past. So the next time you hear one of these names, remember you are participating in an act of resistance against a silence that is thousands of years old. You are helping to rebuild a memory, piece by fragile piece. That persistent impulse to erase the past reveals a fundamental truth about power. The void left by these broken stones is not an empty space. It is a shaped one, carved out by a deliberate hand. Our journey shows that this was never a simple story of one ruler replacing another. It was a complex, enduring campaign waged across centuries, where political ambition, deep cultural anxiety, religious transformation, and cold economic need all converged on the same target. A queen's temple was not just dismantled for its marble, it was condemned as an ideological threat, repurposed as a theological lesson, and melted down as a financial asset all at once. This multifaceted assault ensured her legacy would be attacked from every possible angle, leaving almost no avenue for her memory to survive intact. The result is the profound void we have inherited, a historical landscape where the default image of authority is, and has always been, male. This is not a natural absence, but a constructed one. It is the echo of a silence that was enforced. Yet, as we have traced from the buried statue pits of Egypt to the digital reconstructions of our own time, that silence is being broken. Piece by fragment, line by overlooked text, we are learning to listen to those echoes. Archaeology acts as our forensic tool, critical scholarship as our decoder, and modern technology as our time machine, allowing us to walk through doors that were meant to be sealed forever. This collective effort of recovery is more than an academic exercise. It is a reclamation of a fuller, richer, and more truthful human story. So let this exploration serve as a new lens. When you next stand before an ancient ruin or even a modern monument, look beyond what is presented. Ask what is not there. Question the empty pedestal, the smoothed-over inscription, the building whose origin story feels a little too neat. Actively seek the ghost in the architecture. For every scar on a stone wall, there is a story of creation and a story of conflict. The systematic destruction sought to end the conversation, but the fragments left behind are an invitation to begin it anew. The stones may have been broken, but their echoes, it turns out, are endlessly patient. They have been waiting for us to learn how to hear.